Hello, everyone. I'm Kath Fleet. I'm with Leo, and we're at stand B21. And I'm here to talk to you today about millennials. So I've got a rather dramatic title to my presentation, 2004, the Millennials Event Horizon. I will explain the significance of that in a second. And I'd also like to apologize to any millennials in the audience for the gross generalizations I'm about to make, but I will also qualify that too. Okay, so why is it important for us to talk about the millennials? Well, we believe it's important because we think that helping clients to face the challenges, but also seize the opportunities presented by this generation is really possibly one of the keys to business transformation. And that, to us, is very important for Leo as an organization because of our vision, which is moving learning to the heart of business strategy. And we believe that is important primarily because of learning's transformational capability. Why is it important to move learning to the heart of your business strategy? Well, really, why wouldn't you want to? You know, a business that isn't growing and learning is standing still. And with regard to the millennials, a business that isn't really taking the opportunities presented by its bright new talents is really going to fall behind. So that's why we think it's important to talk about this today. So what is a millennial? Well, that's a good question. In fact, many terms have been used to describe this generation. Generation Y, the baby boomlets, the MyPod generation, the WOW generation. The list is endless. But for our purposes, they are the generation directly after Generation X, which is me and my compatriots. And they were born between 1982 and 2004. By whose definition, you might ask? By the historians William Strauss and Neil Howe, who wrote a book about this whole subject. By the way, there is a paper that accompanies this presentation, and any references that I allude to today are available on our website if you download the e-book that comes with it. And one of the interesting things that Strauss and Howe said about this young set of people is that they are very civic-minded. And I'm going to come back to that later because there's quite a few sort of dichotomies around the millennials that are interesting to explore. But that's just one thing to bear in mind. So why millennial? Well, because they were kind of psychologically and in the media linked to the impending, at the time, year 2000. And for those of us who were around at the time and remember the sort of dawn of that epoch, it was anticipated with excitement, but also quite a lot of fear. The Y2K computer meltdown that was supposed to happen. In actual fact, the opposite happened, and it really was the dawning of the internet era and the ubiquity of computers of all sizes in our everyday lives. And also, they are the largest cohort since the baby boomers. So it's significant in terms of the fact that the quite broad age group that this represents actually will be around for some time yet. You'll be glad to know, for those of you who are millennials. So why 2004, and why do I call it the event horizon? The tipping point, or the point of no return. Well, there are a number of reasons for that. The first is to do with the definition of the millennials itself. So around 2004, and I'll stretch it a little bit, but around 2004, that first wave of millennials were coming of age, having been to college, uni, whatever, entering the workplace. And also, it's the same year that the final wave, if you believe the definition, were born. So, but there were other things that were going on at the time in 2004. One of the important things is that the psychological contract between employer and employee had largely broken down by this time. And that was, I think, certainly in the UK, largely due to the economic decline during the 1980s. When I left school, for example, in 84, there were no job prospects at all. But by the time this generation were leaving school in 2004, we were actually in the middle of an economic boom time. You know, it was great under Labour. We were living beyond our means. But nevertheless, this generation had opportunities. And they probably had the choice of opportunities, the choice of jobs, the choice of promotions, and also able to push for decent money. But another thing was happening in the e-learning industry at the time, and that is that e-learning, and by that I mean online learning, web-based learning, had been around for five years around that time. When I first entered the industry in '99, we were still working on CD-ROMs, and we still had the capability to do lovely, rich video simulations, rich animations. We could make it highly interactive and exploratory, all of those wonderful things that CD-ROM offered us, providing you had enough space on the disk. We didn't have to handle things like bandwidth. And of course, by the time the industry was even just a few years old, we were still struggling with that. E-learning had to take retrograde steps. We were doing quite flat stuff compared to what, us learning designers were doing before. And so it was a frustrating time for designers and developers as well, really. Of course, Flash tried to revive that for a while, but we all know what happened to Flash. So at this time, these young people who were already used to very rich gaming environments at home were coming into the workplace and being faced with e-learning, glorified PowerPoints. No wonder they found it boring. So that's why I say it's a kind of tipping point, and also because of what the millennials have brought us, which we'll look at in a second. So I just want to concentrate for a minute on this final wave of millennials, as I've called it. Here's a young millennial, born in 2004. This is, in fact, my son, Sid. So I feel quite qualified to talk about the learning and development preferences of this generation. This is Sid now. In 2016, the millennials of this era are just entering high school. And so they won't come of age, and this is the reason I mention this, until 2025. I don't know whether you recognize this guy, by the way, but I'll tell you who he is in a minute. I thought he looked a little bit like what Sid might look like in 2025, but maybe I'm being hopeful. Anyway, I digress. The point being that by the year 2025, Deloitte have anticipated that the millennials will account for 75% of the global workforce. So another reason, of course, why we really do need to pay attention to the expectations and needs of this generation. A couple of other things were born in 2004. Facebook. So all of this generation have never known life before Facebook. You may remember that Friends Reunited preceded this by about 5 years. I think that didn't take off because it was aimed at my generation. It was aimed at people who had been out of school by the year 2000 for 5, 10, maybe 15 years and wanted to get back in touch with their old mates. Well, our generation wasn't used to Facebooking. So hence the reason when this came along in 2004, it was the dawning of a generation where young people really wanted to seize on it. And remember that 2004 is that age where that first wave of millennials were now coming of age and entering the workplace. And they were using this straight away. It's also the year that the X Factor was born. And the reason I mention this, and you might twig now or you may not, but that young gentleman on the end is actually Brody Kelly, who was an X Factor contestant this year. The reason I mention this is because I sort of fondly call them the X Factor generation. They're the generation that kind of believe anything is possible. If I can just get the backing, a real entrepreneurial spirit, and things like The Apprentice and Dragon's Den, and all of these have been franchised and made global. Let us not think it's just the UK. Instill this belief that not only can I do it, but I can do it without an employer and largely without a formal education, and I can do it from my bedroom. So, what have the millennials ever done for us? Quite a lot. In fact, they've transformed the way that we learn, share, and interact with each other on a daily basis. And one of the things I will say, just to caveat all of these generalizations I'm making, that I think what's interesting to examine here is not so much the millennials as a fixed age group, because let's face it, lots of people of different ages all use these platforms and apps. It's more to characterize the millennial mindset and what that really means for us in the learning and development industry. So every time I say the word millennial, please don't think that I'm just talking about this age group. What I'm saying is that this age group have defined a mindset that is typical of the internet generation. And I think that's an important sort of distinction to make. So they brought us all of the tools that we now use every single day. And you can see the sort of timeline there. Interestingly, I've included Jimmy Wales and Steve Jobs here, who, as I say, can't age-wise really be bracketed as millennials, but they are typical of the millennial mindset that I've talked about. And the reason I've put them here is because Jimmy Wales first gave us the global platform that enabled people not just to be passive consumers of information on the internet, but to be co-creators, co-authors, and to voice their own expertise. And of course, Steve Jobs, who gave us the handheld platform that actually made all of these other apps take off exponentially. Without that being in our hands, then these other platforms may never have taken such a hold as they have in this generation, because of course it is the here and now generation, and I want it in my hand. So what I want to do now is just introduce you to a few millennials. These are no means exceptional, and if you search on the website for successful entrepreneurs who are millennials, you'll come across all kinds of examples. These four are people who have come to my attention either prior to or during my preparation for doing this today. And they have some very, very interesting stories. And I think they just give us some insight into what this millennial mindset is that I'm talking about. So Mark Fischbach, let's look at him first. His YouTube pseudonym is Markiplier. Markiplier is a gamer, and he's made an absolute fortune for himself by recording himself playing games, doing very, very funny commentary to it, putting them up on YouTube and garnering a massive following. Now, for those of you that don't game or don't know about this sort of activity, gaming is now a massive spectator sport, massive. So much so that it has world championships, it has teams that compete against each other in live events, in massive auditoriums that are live streamed to millions of people. It's huge. And Markiplier is one of at the forefront of this and one of the most popular. He's actually hilarious, and whilst he uses a bit of language that may not be appropriate for the younger millennials, I do recommend you check him out. But you can see that his very loyal following have actually made good on his desire to be a man with a cause. He's actually a big philanthropist, and this really does map back to that quality I mentioned earlier that Strauss and Ho said, that millennials are civic-minded. They're also materialistic and narcissistic as well, and the selfie generation sort of explains that, but they actually do have a very global mindset and are very tolerant as well. And recently, for example, Markiplier's latest live stream on a US channel called Twitch raised £70,000 for depression and bipolar disorder charities. And it's literally just him live streaming his game playing. It's absolutely incredible. So Ryann Hoven, she's otherwise known as Tess Holliday. And again, she's a campaigner. She's a woman with a cause for body image equal rights. And she is a fashion blogger. And she has become so famous, she's garnered such an amazing following, that her sort of loyal followers will shop wherever she shops. And so the big major brands have picked up on this and thought, crikey, I've got a self-made publicist here. If Tess Holliday's wearing my line, then it's got an automatic audience. So now all the major brands have picked her up, and she's the first plus-size model to win a major modelling contract with Milk modelling agency in London, even though she's actually from the US. Jamie Pine is a young lad who, within 4 years of posting his first ever YouTube video, So Yeah, I'm Gay, has amassed millions. And he's done this, again, through speaking to a generation, through speaking for a cause, and through garnering a massive following. His numbers on paper don't look quite so impressive as people like Markiplier and Tess Holliday, but they're still enough to make him a multimillionaire, and he'll be 21 this year. He was picked up by sponsors, and he earns thousands a month through merchandise from his very loyal fans, who basically just, it's a soap opera of his life and his boyfriend Mike on YouTube, and he's made a fortune out of it. And finally, my final example, Jemma Wilson, Cupcake Jemma. She was in the news recently, and she's an entrepreneur that has set up her own startup company called Crumbs and Doilies. And she basically dropped out of art school, so dropped out of formal education, didn't see much of a future in it, started vlogging her cupcake recipes, and has now got a very successful business on her hands where she employs 15 people, and it's set to grow. Her videos have amassed more views than Star Wars: The Force Awakens. she's, again, incredibly popular. Jamie Oliver helped her with her sort of visibility. So why am I saying all this? Well, you may say these aren't typical. They're not typical cases. These are very successful. But actually, there's thousands of examples out there just like this. And what it says to me when I look at these things is this is a generation that kind of not only doesn't need permanent employment, not only isn't seeking a job for life, but isn't necessarily seeking an employer and isn't necessarily seeking any training whatsoever. They're learning what they're doing from each other. But there's also another set of characteristics that are typical of these people, and again, what I would say is more typical of the millennial mindset in general, even if the success of these people isn't typical. And that is that everybody has a public profile, has their life history put on the internet via photos, through blogging, through videos. Everybody has the right to a voice and to express their opinion, be it in discussion forums, through commenting, through rating, through thumbs up, through likes. Everybody has developed an audience of followers, of subscribers, and of basically of buyers. In other words, I think Andy Warhol was right. Everybody is famous. But when you really, really examine, and that was a very insightful statement to make back in 1968, which, by the way, was the year I was born, so it was a long time ago, a very insightful statement to make, because when you look at what he really means by that, and one art critic has analysed it as such, that really when you look at the sort of visual representation of people in the public sphere, it is now open to everybody. Everybody is out there, everybody is promoting themselves. And the millennials, as we've seen from those examples, do this better than anyone. They are fantastic self-promoters. And they know how to use social media in a way that their older counterparts don't. In fact, it's become so ubiquitous that we have to teach it in schools now, how to make sure your social profile doesn't stop you from getting the next job. Your employer is going to be looking at it. But what's really interesting about this is this sense of a kind of flattened hierarchy that everybody has a right to contribute. And I think that's something that is very important here. And of course, everybody has value. Once you're in that public sphere, you're automatically promoting your own value. So, just to sum up then, this is what I think is typical of this aspect of the millennial mindset. They're used to having a voice. They're used to storytelling, verbally, visually, through video. Brand building is very big, and their profile is their CV. And by the way, this isn't just online either. The millennials are extremely good at building their own skills and experience outside in the real world. There's more people gap year traveling and blogging their way through it. There's more people getting involved in societies, in fundraising, in charities when they're at university. There are more people who are basically developing a very diverse range of skills above and beyond what they're learning at uni, because they know they have to differentiate themselves. They've got to make themselves marketable. And they're used to developing an audience, which is really interesting. They play to an audience in a way that people of my age aren't used to doing. And so much so that Jean Twenge, a psychologist, has called them Generation Me, rather controversially. And she reckons that it's born of an element of narcissism. But really, when you look at the capitalistic conditions that these people are living in, they've got, in most cases, something in the region of £26,000 worth of university debts to pay off. They've got very, in the hierarchy of needs, they've got very good reason to look for decent pay and good job prospects. So they've got very good reason to value themselves, to promote themselves. And of course, the social community side of it must never be underestimated. And that, coupled with the gaming, is very, very interesting for this whole blurring of boundaries between the virtual and the real. For example, I know my son much prefers his virtual life to his real life. It's where he has value. He's ranking pretty high on the leaderboard in Minecraft on the German server that he plays on right now. He's got much more value in that world than he does in the real world where he's struggling at school. So you can understand how, that is very alluring to people that face a world that's full of challenges and difficulties. But this last point is very interesting as well. They tend to favour, I hate using that word sorry, tend to favour breadth over depth. So, and by this, please don't get me wrong, I don't mean they're not capable of depth. Of course, they're human beings. They're capable of deep learning just as much as anybody else. But they're used to spinning those plates and keeping them spinning in a way that I'm still not used to. Okay? They're very good at it. So, at any one time, a millennial might be engaged in any or all of these activities. The list deliberately drops off the bottom, by the way, because there's many, many more things they could be doing. But actually, in honesty, multitasking is a slight misnomer. It's a recognizable word, but Linda Stone, who's an ex-Apple consultant and an author, coined the term continual partial attention, which I think is much more appropriate here. And what that actually means is that your attention is literally scattered. It's flitting between lots of different things, and you have a superficial involvement with each of the things that you're flitting across. Now, you could see that as a drawback, but you could also see that as an advantage, actually, because I think that young minds, especially, are very good at taking in quite a lot of information in those short bursts of attention. So what does this kind of all mean when we wrap it all together? I wanted to try and pull it together a little bit, and I'm indebted here to our partners in a couple of projects that we've worked on, Sea Salt Learning, and in particular Julian Stott. I would check out his blog on the Social Age if you can, because it gives you a much, much deeper insight than I can give justice to here. But he's a real key thinker in this. And through working with Julian and Sea Salt on a couple of major projects in the US, we've learned a lot from them. Change is the only constant, as we've already discussed. You know, the economic conditions and the promises of the world are constantly shifting and changing. And as we all know, even from a business perspective, we live in that VUCA world that people talk about. But these people have developed very powerful peer networks before they ever come and seek employment of anybody in this room. And those peer networks will hold strong above and beyond whatever they do when they're working for you. Of course, they're used to learning, or at least having access to information, use the term learning loosely, everywhere and all the time. And this plays into this idea that they're used to access over ownership. Now, the key thing about this is it plays into their values, this civic mindedness or global mindedness that I talked about. If you want to appeal to millennials, you do need to appeal to these values, because they are very, very used to, despite it being a capitalist environment, they're lower on consumerism in the sense that as long as they've got the gadgets to access things, they don't need to own the things that they're accessing. So, for example, I don't need to own my CDs, I don't need to own my DVDs, I just need to be able to access it through a subscription service, which is actually a very green way of doing things. It brings down the use of resources, it brings down the need to create commodities, and it actually creates a better environment for us all. But as I said earlier, they've always got their eye on the next dream job, and one of the clients that I'm going to talk about in a second that we've worked with in the US, SAP, the big global LMS and learning environment development company. They are finding that with the early talents, the new talents they're bringing on board, they're struggling to keep hold of them for more than 2 years. So it's a revolving door, and millennials are basically, they're building their own CVs when they come and work for you. And they trust their own networks. So if you're going to provide a network at work, it needs to be somewhere that they want to hang out in and that they can really learn and develop from. They know they have value because they've worked very hard at building that before they've come to work for you. They know how to market themselves, so they're constantly looking to market themselves to the next employer. They want balance. The work-life balance is very important to this generation because technology offers us so much more flexibility. And really, if they're going to come to you for a brief period of time, they're not terribly interested in your company history, probably not even that interested in where you're going, because they're not going to be with you for the journey. What they're interested in is what you stand for. And this is what maps back to the philanthropists that I talked about earlier and the campaigners that have made it so big on YouTube. There's a reason for that. Markiplier is known as the nicest guy on YouTube. There's a reason why he's so popular with these young people. So what does that mean? How can we solve the opportunities and challenges that we're given? Well, these are some key elements that I think you need to build into all of your initiatives that are aimed at this audience. Value their contributions, so give them a place where they can contribute publicly and show value for it, acknowledge it some way. Engage them in conversation. These people are used to dialogue, continual discourse all the time, even if it's not in any great depth. You know, you can get light bulb moments and you can get great insights from young people if you've given them a place to share their thoughts. And that's great for the business, obviously, and great for the business's agility. So again, recognize achievements, give public recognition for what people contribute, speak to their values, as I've already mentioned. Involve them in their own, in anything that's aimed at them, involve them. You know, we always say that in learning design, that if we're going to make something for an audience, let's involve the audience in how we develop that. Well, you can never say that's more true of this generation. They expect to be involved because they're used to contributing. They're used to co-authoring right from the early days of Wikipedia. So they're used to it and it's expected. And they don't really want training. They want knowledge, experience, and connections because that's all transportable. It's all stuff that they can put on their CV and it's all brand building. In terms of their learning then, what does it mean for their learning? They're very self-directed learners, and I think one of those great offshoots of the multitasking is that they're very proactive. If I want to know something, I go and get it. I don't wait around for somebody to tell me. Now, this might actually be done through sourcing information or the go-to person, because, of course, social networks are incredibly strong here too, so they've probably got somebody they can ask. Competitiveness, that's an interesting one. We're often asked about, oh, really, should we build competitiveness into something? Well, I think yes, if it's a form of reward, if there's some kind of tangible reward that you can associate with that, and mostly that reward will be to do with kudos, to do with credibility, to do with becoming an expert in the field, to do with brand building, in other words. Obviously, through multiple channels. Again, the multitasking capabilities mean that you can fire information at these people using lots of different channels in lots of different ways. They'll quite happily flip between them, and they'll get lots of your key messages from that. And it actually helps to compensate for that sort of lack of needing to remember everything because it's on hand and you can just go and get it. So campaigns where you're using multiple media channels and multiple social channels are great. So obviously learning in short bursts, that stands for itself as well. People want what I need, when I need it, now, and I want to get it quickly. So they need to be able to find what they want and use it very quickly. And if you're going to create a social environment, create it with a flattened hierarchy. Give everybody an equal voice. Let everybody make contributions. Because again, this is what they're expecting. I have a right to voice my opinion. And this is because they want to either go to or become the go-to person. And of course, they learn from each other. So give them a space to do that. It's a primary audience that learn from each other. And any messages you want to give to millennials are better coming from other millennials. I just want to quickly sort of encapsulate what this sort of means in terms of how now compares to the tradition. In traditional training and learning, we always looked at designing stuff to make sure people could remember it and recall it, drill and practice. I'm not saying there isn't a space for that anymore. I think this is largely now the territory of tactical solutions where you have a gap that you need to plug, and there'll always be a need for that. But what I'm saying is it's not the norm anymore. And I do think this is a rather transactional way of learning. I get sent on a course to plug a particular gap. It meets a particular challenge, but is it necessarily transferable to a different challenge, a different environment, so on? I think this way of learning has the potential, and I'm not saying it's the magic bullet, but it has the potential to be much more transformational because it's more adaptive, it's more agile, people are knowing and doing rather than learning out of context. It's situational. So I'm getting my learning, I'm getting my knowledge and my know-how either from people or nuggets of content or a quick video or a chat or an email, whatever it may be, wherever I'm getting that from, I'm using it right now. So I'm applying it at the moment of learning. It's a much more flexible and proactive model, and I think it's much more, has much more potential to meet ongoing business challenges. You know, you create some training, you package it up, you stick it on your LMS. 3 months later, your strategy changes. If you've got much more fluid information architectures going on that people can get a stream of information from, you're always on the money, you're always being proactive. So quickly, I just want to have a look at a couple of examples of what we're doing. Both of the examples are from induction and onboarding, and there's a reason for that. The first being that, although not exclusively, you could argue that induction and onboarding in this age is largely going to be aimed at millennials, because that's the age group that's being inducted into the workforce at the moment. The other reason for it is that there is evidence to say that if you don't get induction and onboarding right, particularly for this group of new talents, they're already thinking about leaving within their first 6 weeks of employment, and they'll probably be gone within a year. So it's really crucial to get this right. We tell our clients this time and time again when they come to us for advice about induction. So let's have a couple of examples. SAP, I mentioned earlier, which is the platforms giant that I'm sure you're familiar with. They make things like the SuccessFactors LMS, but they also make really fantastic social learning platforms, SAP Jam being the most famous. They had a challenge where they wanted to not only engage and value and invest in their early talents, but they wanted the opportunity to be able to spot who had leadership potential, even from day one, spot the superstars, and also keep hold of them. Not just know who they are, but make them want to stay. So they knew they had to address induction because they had a curriculum of over 100 resources, well over 100 resources, that new starters had to get through within their first 3 months of being on the job. That is quite a big demand and quite an uphill struggle. And so what they wanted was some way of contextualizing this to make it fun and interesting for the audience, and also to give them avenues to spotting who the early talents were. So our solution was to play to the strengths of the millennials, to make it fun and interesting. And this is how we did it. We created an overarching narrative which creates a fictional story. So as I said earlier, millennials are quite happy to blur this boundary between reality and fiction, the real and the virtual. So we created this futuristic story. Now, obviously, if you're working for SAP, they're a technology company. So if you're not in the business of sci-fi and technology, then you're probably working for the wrong employer. But we hooked on this idea that there are problems in 2045 that the generation of today could solve if only we could go back in time. So this overarching narrative takes the learner back in time to the present day from 2045, and they get these communications from the future that set them challenges. And the challenges are all set in SAP customer sectors, so they're learning about their customer base as well as actually having challenges to solve. There are 8 missions in these different areas that they have to solve. And all of these missions are managed through a social portal, which is based on the SAP Jam social learning system, and they earn badges and rewards and get recognition, and there's a leaderboard. But crucially, they work in teams. So this is not just about individuals voicing their opinions, it's also about collaboration and working together. So it's reinforcing those values as well, and how several minds are better than one. And of course, because it's all done in the social forums where SAP can see what people are saying, can see the ideas they're coming up with, it's all about ideas generation, they can spot those early talents, and they know who they need to target to keep within the business. This is what it looks like. So it's like a sort of neural network, and that was deliberate because it sort of represents what SAP are all about. And the sort of icons you see on the screen are little nuggets of content, and each of these has a mission associated with it. This one is about food, and they have to explore these little nuggets of content, and there's an overarching narrative that sits with it that explains why you're looking at this. And what they have to do is look at the various bits and pieces, and they have to crack a code. And this unlock code, once they've found all the different bits of information that they need to crack that code, will then unlock a badge and a reward that sits on this public social forum. But in order to do that, they don't just sit and look at stuff. They have to talk to each other on the SAP Jam portal. They have to share knowledge and insights. They have to work it out together. and then they can all use the unlock code to win their badges. And on a team basis, they get badged. So it's in their interest to work together in their teams to solve the problems. So it really drives their curiosity and problem-solving abilities. Another example that we're working on right now is for L'Oreal. And this is a slightly more, if you like, typical scenario where it's an induction that's been around for a few years. The client wants to refresh it, wants to make it really relevant for the current audience and bring it to life a bit and make it sort of less show and tell and more, find and do and get people involved in the brand and in understanding the brands. So they have multiple brands, and I should say actually that this is currently in the design phase as I speak. So what I'm showing you today is hot off the press. But I wanted to show you a very recent example, being as obviously we're talking about the latest developments. So they really wanted to make the induction more immersive, more engaging. They wanted more activity in there. It needed to be more bite-sized and dip in and out. And time's up. And adaptive and personalised. So I'll just quickly show you what we did. We allowed them to personalise the content to begin with, so they can base it around their location, their passions, which brands they're most interested in. And once they make their selections from this and their particular areas of interest, the interface that they then see not only greets them personally, but it also prioritises content based on their personal preferences. But because we're interested in grab and go and granular content, we create, obviously, the sitemap that sits behind it, so you can just jump to anything that you need. And as you move down, it uses a nice deep scrolling interface. Again, the scroll of death is no longer a thing to avoid because touchscreen devices make this very intuitive, very scannable, very easy to look for what you need. So this content is then prioritized according to that particular learner's needs. And we also made it mission-based, so when you get down to the bottom, you have all of these different social missions that you get sent out on. And it could be things to do with go into your high street, wherever you're located, find the L'Oreal stand, take a selfie of yourself, come back, stick it on the social forum, get involved. So it's introducing people to each other. There's lots of short bites of video, and we embed them very, very quickly using contextualized questions. So you just watch a couple of questions. Yes, I've got the main point. I move on. And again, it's all held on the same screen, so no clicking next to wait for the next screen to buffer. The social platforms are actually embedded in the e-learning app itself. So rather than having to link out or go to another platform, it's provided for you in context. So once you've done your mission and you're coming back to do a bit more learning, you can upload your photos that you've taken and blog your entry about what you found and what it said about the brand and so on. So it's all there, ready for people to use. And of course, you earn your achievements for doing all of the missions as well. And in summary, that's my top tips for designing for millennials. And there's more information. If you come to the stand at B21, we've got some hot chocolate giveaways, which has a link to it, to a paper that accompanies this, that you can explore some of these themes a bit further. I realise I've run over time, so if you have any questions, please do come to the stand. As I say, B21, and I'd be happy to carry on the conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you.